Snow White was lovely. Oh, so very lovely. Her skin was like fresh cream, her lips a juicy cherry, her hair as black as a raven's wing. But behind that pretty face a nasty thought was brewing. A thought as green and foul as goblin stew. She looked across the village square and saw her rival, Red Riding Hood. Red was popular, you see. The villagers loved her gutsy charm. They loved the way she'd face that wolf and come out grinning. Snow White did not like this one bit. She wanted all the love, all the cheers, all for herself, so she decided to do something quite horrid. She started with a whisper, a tiny, slippery thing. She leaned close to the baker, a man of flour and gossip. "Have you heard?" she murmured, her voice like honey mixed with grit, "about Little Red? They say she didn't escape that wolf alone." The baker's eyes grew wide. Snow White continued, her smile as sharp as a needle. "They say she made a deal with those who live deep in the woods, the ones who practice dark arts." The word hung in the air, heavy and sticky like a spider's web. A seed of doubt was planted right there between the sacks of yeast and sugar. The whisper grew. It slithered from the baker to the butcher, from the butcher to the candlestick maker. It twisted and it turned, gaining new and dreadful details with every telling. "She speaks to the shadows," one villager would say. "She dances with wolves under the full moon," another would add, their voice trembling with delicious fear. Snow White watched it all unfold, her hands neatly folded in her lap. She was a gardener of gossip, tending to her wicked little plant. She knew exactly how fear worked. It didn't need truth to grow, it only needed a place to take root. By evening the whole village was buzzing. The whispers had become a roar. Red Riding Hood was no longer the brave girl who beat the wolf. Oh no, she was something else entirely, something to be feared, something to be watched. The children who once ran to greet her now hid behind their mother's skirts. The friendly waves she received were replaced with suspicious stares. Snow White saw it all from her window, a perfect picture of innocence. She looked at her reflection in the glass and gave a little wink. The first part of her nasty plan was a smashing success. The next morning the sun rose on a village transformed. The air, usually filled with the smell of fresh bread and the sound of cheerful greetings, was thick with suspicion. When Red Riding Hood walked into the market, a bright red cloak around her shoulders, a hush fell over the crowd. It was not a respectful hush. It was a cold, sharp silence that pricked at her skin. She tried to smile at Mrs. Higgins, the woman who sold the plumpest chickens, but the woman turned her back, clutching a wooden cross she wore around her neck. Red's smile faltered. Something was terribly, terribly wrong. She walked on, her basket feeling heavy on her arm. A group of men standing near the well stopped their chatter and simply stared. One of them spat on the ground as she passed. Then, a small boy, no older than 7, picked up a rotten tomato from a discarded crate. His mother saw, but she did not stop him. He threw it with all his might. The tomato splattered against Red's cloak, leaving a wet, seeping stain. A few people gasped, but many more just watched, their faces hard and unforgiving. Red stood frozen, the sticky juice dripping down her cape. This was only the beginning. Soon, others joined in. A lump of mud, a shriveled carrot, a small, sharp pebble that stung her cheek. They called her names. "Witch!" one voice shrieked. "Wolf friend!" cried another. Red looked around, searching for a friendly face, for anyone who remembered the girl she was yesterday, but she found only masks of fear and anger. Her followers, the few friends who had gathered to support her, were pushed and shoved. The villagers were a mob, their reason lost to the poison Snow White had so carefully poured into their ears. Red did not cry. Her shock turned quickly to a cold, hard fury. She saw Snow White watching from a distance, standing beside the fountain, looking as pure and as blameless as a fresh-fallen snowflake. Their eyes met for a moment across the chaotic square. In that single glance, Red understood everything. This was not a random turn of fortune, this was a deliberate attack. A war had been declared, not with swords or with armies, but with lies. And as another stone flew past her head, Red knew she could not fight this battle here, in a place that no longer felt like home. Snow White wasn't finished. Oh, not by a long shot. Ruining Red's reputation was just the starter course. For the main dish, she had something far more cunning planned. She retreated to her chambers, a place of silk cushions and polished mirrors. From a locked rosewood box, she took out a special quill. It was not made from a normal goose feather. This feather had been plucked from a griffin, and it shimmered with a faint magical light. Beside it was a small pot of ink, black as a starless night. This was no ordinary ink. It was storyteller's ink, a potent and dangerous magic. With this ink, one could write things into being. Not just stories on a page, but changes to the grand story of the world itself. It was a tricky sort of magic. It couldn't create something from nothing, but it could twist what was already there. It could bend the truth until it was shaped like a pretzel. Snow White dipped the griffin quill into the dark, swirling liquid. She intended to write a new chapter for Red Riding Hood, one that would confuse everyone, including Red herself. She would make the story so muddled that no one would know what to believe. She began to write on a piece of fine parchment. Her first sentence was filled with praise. Red Riding Hood, she wrote, the ink flowing like silk, is a hero of the people, a savior of the innocent, who single-handedly protected the village from a great and terrible beast. She smiled as the words appeared. This was the clever part. You couldn't just write awful things. The magic needed balance, a little bit of truth to anchor the lies. So she would build Red up, only to tear her down in the very next breath. It was a cruel and brilliant game. After writing of Red's heroism, she added a darker twist. But this brave girl keeps a terrible secret, she continued, the quill scratching slightly as the magic took a wicked turn. She draws her strength from a forbidden pact, a dark bargain made with the very creatures she pretends to fight. Her red cloak is not a symbol of innocence, but a banner for the witches of the Whispering Woods. Snow White sat back, admiring her work. She had painted Red as both a saint and a sinner, a protector and a traitor. The confusion would be absolute. The villagers wouldn't know whether to cheer for Red or burn her at the stake. The magic of the ink spread instantly, not through the air but through the minds of the people. It rewrote their memories, patched their understanding, and left them in a state of utter bewilderment. One moment, a villager would recall with perfect clarity the image of Red Riding Hood standing triumphantly over the defeated wolf, a local champion. They would feel a surge of pride and want to rush to her side, to apologize for their earlier cruelty, and offer her a garland of flowers. This was the first part of Snow White's wicked script taking hold, the story of the hero. But then, just as quickly, the memory would curdle. A new thought would intrude, sharp and sour. They would suddenly remember seeing Red sneaking into the woods at midnight, her red cloak blending with sinister shadows. They would recall hearing her chant strange words to the moon, her voice not her own. This was the second part of the spell, the tale of the traitor. The villager caught between two conflicting certainties would be left rubbing their temples, confused and deeply unsettled. Was Red their greatest protector or their most dangerous enemy? They simply couldn't decide. The result was chaos of a different kind. The open hostility of the morning was replaced by a paranoid uncertainty. People would start to praise Red, then stop mid-sentence, a look of doubt clouding their faces. "She saved us all from that wolf," one man would declare loudly, only to add in a nervous whisper, "But what if the wolf was her pet?" The stories changed from hour to hour, sometimes from minute to minute. Red Riding Hood became a legend, a myth, a puzzle that no one could solve. She was a hero and a villain, all at once. Red felt the shift immediately. The stones stopped flying, but the stares became more intense, more questioning. People would approach her, an apology on their lips, then shrink back in fear. They would offer her a loaf of bread, then snatch it away as if it were poisoned. She was trapped in a bizarre limbo, a nightmare woven from Snow White's ink. She was no longer just hated, she was an unsolvable riddle. This, she realized, was a far crueler prison than the straightforward scorn she had faced before. It was a cage made of confusion, and Snow White held the only key. Red Riding Hood had had enough. She was tired of the whispers, the stones, and now this maddening confusion. Standing right there in the middle of the village that had become a madhouse of her own story, she felt a cold rage settle deep in her bones. It was a rage that burned away all fear and all sadness. She looked toward the pristine white cottage where Snow White lived, a picture of perfect charm. Red knew with a certainty that cut through all the magical confusion that her enemy was sitting in that house enjoying this spectacle. She would not let this stand. With her head held high, she turned her back on the village. She didn't run. She walked. Every step was deliberate, a silent promise of what was to come. The villagers parted before her, their faces a mess of conflicting emotions. They didn't know whether to stop her or to cheer her on. She ignored them all. Her path was clear now. The village had turned on her, swayed by lies and magic. Fine. If they believed she was in league with the dark things in the forest, then that is exactly where she would go. She would embrace the story Snow White had written for her. As she entered the gloomy eaves of the Whispering Woods, the place of so many dark legends, Red did not feel fear. Instead, she felt, well, a sense of homecoming. The twisted branches of the ancient trees seemed to welcome her, their shadows like comforting arms. The villagers were afraid of this place, but Red remembered her grandmother's true tales. Not the silly stories for children, but the real ones. Tales of the wood's ancient power, of the wise women who lived in its heart, the ones the villagers foolishly called witches. They were keepers of old magic, a magic far older and deeper than Snow White's enchanted ink. She walked for what felt like hours, deeper and deeper into the forest's embrace. The air grew thick with the scent of damp earth and strange nocturnal blossoms. Finally, she came to a clearing where the moonlight struggled to pierce the canopy. In the center stood a circle of moss-covered stones, and from the shadows between the trees figures emerged. They were the witches of the wood, their faces lined with wisdom and power. They had been expecting her. "The girl in red," one of them rasped, her voice like the rustling of dry leaves. "You seek revenge. We can help you with that." The witches gathered around Red Riding Hood, their eyes glowing faintly in the gloom of the forest clearing. They were not the cackling, wart-nosed creatures from frightened bedtime stories. They were women of immense power, their connection to the earth and its secrets running deeper than the roots of the oldest oaks. They listened patiently as Red told her tale, her voice steady and filled with cold fury. She spoke of Snow White's poisonous whispers, the villagers' betrayal, and the disorienting magic of the storyteller's ink. She did not ask for pity, she asked for a weapon. The eldest witch, a woman named Morwen, stepped forward. Her face was a map of 100 winters, but her eyes were sharp and clear. "The storyteller's ink is a powerful tool of the Fae," she said, her voice low and resonant. "It bends the present, but we command a stronger magic. We do not bend the story, we rewrite its ending. We deal in fate." She offered Red a quill. This one was very different from Snow White's. It was carved from bone, and the feather was from a crow that had feasted on the battlefields of forgotten kings. It was a grim, potent thing. "This is the Quill of Fates," Morwen explained, her voice echoing slightly in the clearing. "Whatever you write with it will become destiny. But be warned, child, fate is a river, and changing its course requires a great price. It will demand a piece of your own story, a piece of your heart, to fuel its power." Red did not hesitate. She had already lost her home, her name, her place in the world. What was one more piece of herself? She took the bone quill, its cold surface feeling strangely alive in her hand. It seemed to thrum with a dark and ancient energy. The witches began a low, humming chant, their voices weaving together to form a tapestry of power. They brought forth an ink pot, not filled with black ink, but with a liquid that shimmered like captured moonlight mixed with blood. It was brewed from sorrow and regret, and the ink of squids from the deepest, sunless trenches of the sea. "Write her new fate," Morwen commanded. "Write the future you wish for the one who wronged you. The quill will guide your hand, the ink will make it true." Red dipped the bone quill into the shimmering ink and turned to a fresh, waiting scroll of bark. The war was about to enter its next terrible phase. Red began to write. The Quill of Fates moved across the bark scroll, not with the smooth grace of Snow White's pen, but with a heavy, deliberate finality. Each word she wrote felt like a stone being dropped into the still pool of the future, sending ripples out that could never be undone. She did not wish for Snow White's death. That was too simple, too quick. No, she wanted her to experience the same slow, creeping despair that she had been forced to endure. She wanted Snow White to lose everything that she held dear, starting with the one thing she valued most. "Let her beauty fade," Red wrote, the crimson-tinged ink sinking into the bark. "Let the face she adores become a stranger to her." As the words were written, miles away in her luxurious cottage, Snow White felt a strange tingling sensation on her skin. She rushed to her famous magic mirror, the one that had always validated her vanity. "Mirror, mirror, on the wall," she began, but stopped short. The reflection staring back at her was different. A fine line had appeared beside her eye. A small, ugly blemish was forming on her chin. Her skin, once like cream, now looked pale and sallow. It was a subtle change, but to Snow White, it was a catastrophe. Red continued to write, her fury guiding the quill. Let her friends turn against her. Let the loyalty she commands turn to ash. Back in the village, the 7 dwarfs, who had always been Snow White's most devoted protectors, suddenly felt a change of heart. Grumpy, who had always been secretly fond of her, now found her presence irritating. Doc's admiration turned to suspicion. Happy found her laughter grating. They began to bicker with her over small things, questioning her judgment and openly mocking her growing obsession with her appearance. The bonds of friendship, once as strong as steel, began to rust and crumble away. The final, most devastating line was written with a flourish, and let the source of her pride, her magic mirror, show her only the truth of her own ugliness, inside and out. In Snow White's room, a loud cracking sound echoed. She looked in horror as a thin, jagged fracture raced across the surface of her magic mirror. When she peered into the fractured glass, it no longer showed her a flattering image. It showed her a reflection twisted by her own jealousy and cruelty. The mirror, now broken, was finally telling the truth. The villagers, once swayed by her charm, now saw the pettiness beneath and began to fear her unpredictable nature. The curse was complete. The world Snow White had built for herself collapsed with shocking speed. Her fading beauty was a constant gnawing torment. Each morning she would wake and rush to the cracked mirror, only to find a new flaw, a new sign of decay. The vibrant cherry of her lips had dulled and the bright sparkle in her eyes had been replaced by a desperate, haunted look. People in the village began to whisper again, but this time the whispers were about her. They said she looked tired. They said she looked old. The words were like tiny daggers to her heart. Her friends, once her staunchest allies, now avoided her completely. The dwarfs, who had once mined gems for her, now muttered curses when she approached. They saw her not as a fair princess, but as a sour, vain woman who had brought nothing but trouble. The villagers, freed from her confusing spell and now seeing her for what she was, recoiled from her. They remembered how she had turned them against Red Riding Hood, how she had manipulated their fears for her own selfish gain. Their admiration curdled into a mixture of fear and contempt. Snow White was utterly alone. She wandered through her pretty cottage, which now felt like a cold, empty tomb. The silken cushions brought her no comfort. The polished floors reflected a face she no longer recognized. Her entire identity had been built on being the fairest of them all, the most loved, the most admired. Without that, who was she? She was just a lonely woman in a fancy house, with a cracked mirror and a garden full of bitter memories. The victory she had tasted just a short while ago now felt like dust and ashes in her mouth. This isolation did not break her spirit, however. It hardened it. Her sorrow and despair slowly crystallized into a single sharp point of hatred. All of this was because of Red Riding Hood. Red, the girl in the silly cloak, had dared to fight back. She had stolen her beauty, her friends, her kingdom of adoration. Snow White would not accept this fate. The quill might have written her destiny, but she still believed she could add a final, bloody postscript. She was not a victim. She was a queen, even if her only subject was herself, and she would have her revenge. In the deepest corner of her cellar, where the light did not reach, Snow White kept one last secret. It was a relic from an older, darker story, a time before she was a celebrated princess. It was an apple tree, but not a normal one. It grew no leaves and bore fruit only once a decade. The fruit it produced was a single, perfect apple. Its skin was a mesmerizing crimson, so deep and glossy it looked like polished bloodstone. It was beautiful, tempting, and lethally poisonous. This was the same kind of apple her stepmother had once used, a tool of ultimate envy. She knew the risks. This was not a magic of ink or whispers. This was a magic of endings. It did not confuse or curse, it simply stopped the story cold. But she was desperate. Red Riding Hood had taken her life from her piece by piece. Now she would take Red's in a single decisive bite. She carefully plucked the apple from its gnarled branch. It felt cold and heavy in her hand, a perfect sphere of malice. She polished it on her sleeve, not to make it shinier, but as a ritual, a focusing of her hatred into this one deadly object. Her plan was simple. There would be no more tricks, no more elaborate schemes. She would find Red Riding Hood, wherever she was hiding, and offer her this beautiful, deadly gift. Perhaps she would disguise herself as an old woman, a nod to the tales of the past. Or perhaps she would go as herself, a final face-to-face confrontation between two fallen fairy tale queens. She hadn't decided on the details yet. All that mattered was the end result. Red, silenced forever by the apple's poison. It was a grim and terrible thought, but it was the only thing that brought a smile to her faded lips. Holding the crimson apple, Snow White felt a surge of her old power return. It was not the power of beauty or charm, but the cold, hard power of resolve. The war was not over. The Quill of Fates may have written her downfall, but she would write the epilogue. She would have the final word. She stood before the cracked mirror, no longer seeing her own flawed reflection, but seeing the future she intended to create. She saw Red Riding Hood, fallen. She saw herself, triumphant. The apple in her hand seemed to pulse with a faint, dark light, ready for the final act to begin.